Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Virtual Author Series, live from Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. We're very glad you could join us this evening. This is the second in our installment of Fall Virtual Author Series programs. We'll tell you about our guest in a moment. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markison. I work in the Hall of Fame's Education Department. And it'll be my pleasure and privilege to talk to our guest tonight. He is Steve Steinberg. Steve is a well-known baseball historian and award-winning author. He has written the books Urban Shocker, Silent Hero of Baseball's Golden Age. Also wrote the book The World Series in the Dead Ball Era. Tonight, Steve will be joining us to discuss his latest book. It's co-authored with Lyle Spatz, another great writer and researcher. And the book is titled Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life, From Baseball Idol to Stage and Screen. So we're very happy to have Steve Steinberg with us. Steve, welcome to the Virtual Author Series. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Bruce, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about a guy that's been long forgotten who has a great story.
Yeah, long forgotten, and that really shouldn't be the case. In preparing to talk to you tonight, a fascinating career in life, one of the most colorful characters the game has ever seen. And before we get into the Q&A and prepare for questions from the audience later on, let's provide a little bit of background on the subject of your book. Mike Donlin, one of the most colorful ball players of the early 20th century. And for a time, he was actually the most popular athlete, regardless of sport, in New York City. He was part of the New York Giants National League Championship team in 1904, helped the team win the World Championship in 1905, someone that later became involved rather prominently as an actor and was married to a rather famous actress from the silent era. So, Steve, what specifically motivated you to write a comprehensive biography of this long ago player? Obviously, very colorful, fascinating individual. But was there one thing in particular that kind of triggered you and said, yeah, I need to sit down and write a book start to finish?
Well, Lyle and I tend to focus on people that have been overlooked and forgotten that at one time were quite famous. It's sort of intriguing how fame can be pretty fleeting and here today, gone tomorrow. And Donlin's life is just so compelling. And beyond that, we were really surprised to find out what a great hitter he was. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he was one of the greatest hitters in the history of the game. And again, with a story that almost seems more like fiction than truth.
You and Lyle have collaborated on some earlier books. I'm curious how the collaboration process works between the two of you.
Well, Lyle and I do he's way down in southeastern Florida, and I'm up in Seattle, and we exchange files and on the internet. But we heavily edit each other's writing. Obviously, somebody has to do the first draft of a chapter, and but once we're done, it's really a melding of the minds. There's countless rounds that we do of writing and editing. We get input from some of our colleagues and from a fact checker. So we do a series of rounds, and there's a give and take. And I think we each have our own strengths and weaknesses and complement each other. And it's a challenging process. It's more complicated, I think, than writing a book on your own, which I did with my Urban Shocker book. But I think the end result is pretty special when you have the input and the insight of two people, not just one.
Right. You mentioned Donlin was a great hitter. Give us a complete scouting report of him as a player. What positions did he play? What were his strengths? What were his weaknesses?
Well, Donlin actually started out in the minors and semi-pro ball as a pitcher, but he very quickly became an outfielder, and he just was a terrific hitter and a power hitter for the dead ball era. And we don't have any video of him. And one of the things that happens when you do research with different newspapers is you sometimes get somewhat conflicting descriptions of how he hit. But even though he was a power hitter, he didn't grip the ball of the bat from the very end the way Babe Ruth would do and make it a style a couple decades later. But he was incredibly colorful. And in the seasons that he played, more close to full time, and for a combination of reasons, he missed a number of seasons. he was one of the top 2 or 3 hitters in the game, whether measured by batting average or even the new metrics like OB on base plus slugging and slugging percentage. And he hit to all fields and had a good arm also. But it was his hitting that really made his mark.
He was not a big guy, 5'9", right?
Right. Well, back in those days, that's true. There weren't a lot of really big guys, and guys that are over 6 feet were considered giants back then. But he packed a wallop with his bat, and he loved the drama. The bigger the stage and the bigger the moment, the more he reveled in it. And unlike some more private kinds of characters, such as Christy Mathewson, Donlin just loved being in New York and loved being in the center of attention.
He played outfield and first base, correct?
Right, right. And primarily outfield,
Yeah. Steve, let's talk about his wonderful nickname. That's one of the great things about baseball. You go back to the 19th century, or in the case of Donlin, early 20th century. He had this phenomenal nickname, Turkey Mike. Where did that come from, and did he like it?
Well, we never nailed down the first writer that used it, but Donlin was a pretty cocky kind of guy, and he had a strut, almost the way a turkey would have it. And, I don't know if he particularly cared for it. I mean, he didn't dislike it as much as John McGraw, his manager, hated the name Muggsy. But supposedly kids across America, would imitate that strut. And he was really one of the early bad boys of the game. He was not a choir boy by any means, and I think that bad boy appeal certainly in New York, maybe not in Chicago, where the hated Cubs of the Giants, was just incredibly popular, and he's just sort of fallen off of the radar of most everybody today.
Yeah. Did he like the nickname, or did he resent it?
We did so much digging on that. We think I really cannot say for sure. I've got to actually say I'm not, and I should know come across the answer to that. But he never openly objected to it. I don't think that he particularly loved it, but he was not that objectionable to it.
Yeah. Of course, back then, whether you liked a nickname or not, you were generally stuck with it. It's a little bit different today. If a
Right.
player really doesn't like a nickname, he'll let the media know, let his teammates know. That's not the case in Donlin's era.
Right. Right.
Yeah. In terms of his personality, I understand that he had a lot of charm, a lot of charisma. He was very likable, but also at the same time, he had this propensity to get into arguments and fights. So that's kind
Well,
of interesting.
that's probably an understatement. Yeah, he had a drinking problem, and at times it got him in a lot of trouble. There was one time that it almost cost him his life when he was in a bar in St. Louis, and he was teasing somebody in the bar who had a big bushy beard, and actually Donlin was drinking too much and was running his fingers. You can imagine how this would play out through the beard of this guy. And when the guy left the bar and Donlin followed him out, the guy's buddy came up behind Mike with a knife and slashed him from ear to ear.
Mm.
And luckily, the cut did not go that deep, and Mike would have that scar on the side of his face for the rest of his life. And Haywood Broun, the well-known writer, the father of Haywood Broun, some of us may remember from Wide World of Sports, would tell a story. I don't know if it's apocryphal, but it certainly fits that Donlin walked into a bar in St. Louis, heard there was a brawl going in the back room, and asked the bartender if he could join the fight or if it was a private fight. He reveled in scraps.
We talk about the drinking problem that he had. Was that something that persisted throughout his career? Did he ever try to rehabilitate himself? I'm not sure if there were even treatment centers at that time. Was it a problem he tried to address, or was this something that kind of stayed with him throughout his baseball days?
It stayed with him until he fell in love with and married one of the most famous actresses in America. And he did have one time early in their marriage when he fell off the wagon, and Mabel Hite, his wife, who he was very much in love with. It was really a very special relationship. Really laid down the law, and he basically did not drink for the rest of the time they were married. Subsequent to her passing, we may talk about that. He did gravitate towards alcohol again and had a couple of very famous drinking buddies from Hollywood. But he actually, and we touch upon this in the book, there actually was a clinic in a little town of Dwight, Illinois, called the Keeley Institute, which
Hmm.
actually tried to treat alcoholism. And it became so famous that the Keeley Institute had branches not only across America, but even in Western Europe.
Hmm.
So he kept it really under control for the woman that he loved. But after he lost Mabel, he was drinking again in his later life.
Do we know if it was like a condition of their relationship that he had to stop drinking or she would leave him?
Yeah, they were very public, and she went very public. And when they had this in 1907, when he went out and got drunk, and really was quote unquote misbehaving, and she told the press that how much she loved him and how wonderful he was, except when he did this, and he it was, and he knew that. He would have to taper that or else or control that, and he literally just stopped drinking for a number of years.
We'll talk a lot more about the relationship between Mike Donlin and his wife, Mabel Hite, a little bit later in the program. Let's talk about his early days as a player before he really settled into stardom with the New York Giants. Early on, he bounced around with a number of teams. He played with the St. Louis Cardinals, Baltimore Orioles, Cincinnati Reds. Didn't really stay with any organization for anything beyond a year or two. Why was that?
Well, his drinking had a lot to do with that, and you're putting a photograph up there of Donlin at bat wearing a Cincinnati uniform. And even though he was a power hitter, I find the picture really intriguing because you can see his hand there. So clearly, even the power hitters in the dead ball era sometimes were, they were not swinging from the end of the bat.
Right.
He came up in St. Louis, and one of his teammates was John McGraw that year. And then the very following year, 1901, was the first year of the American League. It was only a National League, it was the only major league until that time. And McGraw took over the Baltimore franchise as part owner and manager, a very young John McGraw, not much older than Donlin. And he got Donlin to break away from the National League. Mike, unfortunately, in early 1902, got drunk and attacked an actress and missed most of the season in prison. He was released
Wow.
by Baltimore. The Cincinnati Reds gave him a chance, but after a couple of years, he wore out his welcome there. And McGraw gave him another chance. John McGraw now had moved on to take over the New York Giants and was building them into a powerhouse. And so they reconnected for the third. This was the third time they were together, the second time as manager-player relationship.
When they were teammates in Cincinnati, they got along well.
They in Cincinnati was the one time that they weren't. When Donlin went to prison, the Baltimore Orioles and McGraw released him, and he went to Cincinnati. But when he was in Baltimore, he and McGraw did get along well. They tended to be both very hot-tempered, and I think they edged each other on when it came to getting into arguments with umpires. And both of them got ejected numerous times. Donlin, I don't know if this is the only time in the history of the game he actually got ejected for arguing balls and strikes because he was upset that the umpire called ball 4 when he was chasing Honus Wagner for the batting title one year, and he didn't want to go to first base. He wanted another chance to hit. So he was ejected for arguing that it should have been called strike 2 and not ball 4, so he could get another chance for a hit.
I said mistakenly they were teammates in Cincinnati. Of course, they were with the Orioles, where McGraw was a very fine player before he became a manager. Let's talk a little bit more about the photo which you reference. It's interesting as we get a sense of what uniforms were like in the early part of the 20th century. It's a wool uniform. It's got the full collar, which is kind of propped up a little bit. And the cap is a lot different. Doesn't seem to be much of a bill on that cap. And this is it's one of the interesting things about baseball from this era. The uniforms so completely different from what we're used to today.
Right. And yeah, I'm not a uniform expert. One of the other things that every now and then you see photographs of them, like early in spring training when the weather isn't warm, and you see them wearing sweaters, which are very, very cool also. And you also touch upon, I just want to go back on it for a moment about John McGraw. He's thought of as such a great manager, and he was, but people forget what an absolutely sensational ball player John McGraw was. And just as one aside, when he was with Donlin, his on-base percentage, he has the third highest on-base percentage of anybody in the history of the game. So long before analytics and sabermetrics, John McGraw knew that you win games by scoring runs and you score runs by getting on base. And the only two players ahead of him, a little trivia question, is Ted Williams and Babe Ruth in that order.
Wow. Yeah, I had no idea. I mean, I knew he was a good player, but no idea that his on-base percentage was that high. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
He does eventually find a more permanent home, at least as permanent as it could be with Mike Donlin, and that is with the New York Giants. They acquired him as part of a rather complicated three-team trade, and he would remain with the Giants for about 4.5 seasons, including a world championship in 1905. What was it, Steve, that allowed him to achieve some stability, staying in New York for a while after that had really eluded him in the early part of his career? Did his drinking situation improve?
That's a great question. I think, John McGraw always had the belief that he could control anybody, whether it was drinking or even like years later with Hal Chase with other issues. And to McGraw and Donlin's credit, in 1905, Donlin did not go off drinking, and there were really no incidents. And I think, so I think McGraw deserves some of the credit for that. Donlin got married in 1906, and I think Mabel, his wife, took over. And for all we know, they were probably dating in 1905, so he maybe already was behaving, and it was stability into his life. And talking about stability, when he fell in love with his famous actress, that really brought stability, because his mother was killed in a spectacular train accident when he was a child. His father died a few years later. Numerous siblings died young, which interestingly parallels some of the issues in John McGraw's life, because his mother and a number of his siblings died very young. So New York, and then with his wife, there was stability there, and the drinking was under control.
Yeah. You bring up the tragedy of losing his parents. I want to start with the very first chapter, where you and Lyle write about his kind of early days. At least you reference it early on. It's page 3, chapter 1. The chapter is called Growing Up with Tragedy. And this is what you write at the very start. Some people seem to glide effortlessly through life from one success to another. Others seem doomed to heartbreak, with adversity and even tragedy shadowing them. Mike Donlin was one of these others, and his struggles with misfortune may have driven his inner strife. Yet he never conceded defeat in life and succeeded in sport, entertainment, and love. Legendary sports writer Damon Runyon noted, "He never asked the world for anything but an even break in his life." I think that's a great opening to the book. I don't know if the two of you split up the writing, or if one of you or the other maybe deserves full credit there, but it's a wonderfully worded paragraph, and I think a great introduction to what Mike Donlin went through. Yes, very colorful, flamboyant, but lots of tragedy and maybe difficult feelings underneath the exterior.
Right, and that, without becoming too much of an armchair psychologist, may have explained his overcompensating and his cockiness, because people that got to know him and his friends, he was a very down-to-earth guy. And later in his life, when he gravitated towards Hollywood, he became a beloved character there. And Damon Runyon was, really the premier sports writer in the teens. And we have a blurb on the back of our book, even though Damon died about 90 years before we wrote the book, that he compared Mike Donlin to Babe Ruth. And he said Donlin was far more colorful than Babe Ruth, walking up to the plate, holding that bat, even though he was not a big guy, but holding it like a toothpick. He was a very strong guy. It just, it sent a thrill through the crowd that even Babe Ruth could not compare with, which says a lot.
That quote from the back cover, I'll read it. "Turkey Mike was the most picturesque, colorful baseball player I ever saw. He had more pure color than that mighty man, George Herman Babe Ruth. So that's what Damon Runyon said. That's the quote on the back of the book. Steve, going back to his time with the Giants, and it was really 1905 when he really put it together as a player completely at his peak. How good a player was Mike Donlin?
Well, he was one of the best, and by one of the best, I mean certainly one of the best uh, uh, two or three players in the game, hitters in the game. I think Honus Wagner, if you look at even at some of the modern day metrics, had the edge on him, and I think Donlin was second in the batting title to Wagner two or three times. Wagner definitely had the edge, although Wagner was not a very colorful player, and perhaps some of the pitchers like Mordecai Brown and obviously Christy Mathewson might have been up there, but Donlin would have been in that group of if you're going to have the five greatest players in the game, certainly the five greatest hitters in the game, if not the greatest two or three.
Do you think he was on pace for the Hall of Fame if he had played longer?
Well, he did, and we're going to get into a little bit more. He has a career 333 batting average, and he missed the 1902 season because of being in jail. He would miss 1906 after they won the championship when he fractured his ankle, and then he had other years when he hooked up with his wife and during the peak of his career. So he played in over 1,000 games, but during five peak seasons, he probably missed close to 1,000 games.
Wow. Let's talk about him in 1905. Now, the uniform here, I guess, is from 1906, the following year, right?
Right.
And the Giants on the jersey put world's champions. I'm sure all the other teams loved to see that. But hey, I guess they had a right to brag. They were the defending champions at that point. That 1905 season, Donlin, I'm assuming, was the best everyday player on the team. Any specific recollections that you talk about in the book about the ways that he kind of led that team to the championship?
He was just the one that they counted on, and he played, virtually every game. And he would replicate that in 1908, the famous season with the Merkel game. But nothing specifically jumps out right now. But he was the hitter, and he led them in hitting in the World Series, although obviously overshadowed by the fact that Christy Mathewson won three games, three shutouts in that 1905 series against the Philadelphia Athletics.
That's interesting. Christy Mathewson. Now that's a totally different personality. Were you able to get into their relationship at all?
Yeah, they weren't really close because Mathewson, from my understanding of him, and not an expert on him, although I've read a lot of, there's 3 or 4 good bios of him, including one by Ray Robinson. Mathewson was a very private guy and a very aloof guy. And we go into the fact that Donlin was so much more popular than Mathewson during this time period, even in 1908, when Mathewson was winning more than 30 games. And one of the New York newspapers had you could vote for the most popular player. And Donlin won easily, and Mathewson was way, way far behind. Mathewson, when the game was over, he felt it was his life. He didn't owe the fans anything. Where Donlin, he'd show up on Broadway, and the crowd would cheer him or adore him, and he reveled in it. He reveled in that attention.
Steve, I'm curious about this picture. I don't know if we can read too much into it or maybe not read enough. But in this picture, he's got a very stern look. He doesn't look too pleased. Again, it's just one photo, it's one moment in time, but does that offer any glimpse into his personality?
Well, yeah, that's a good question because certainly in his playing career, you don't see pictures where he's smiling. And I think he projected the aggressiveness and the intimidation that his manager, John McGraw, had. And I don't think we can find too many pictures of McGraw, during this time period when he was smiling. Unfortunately, even though, their careers crossed paths so often, one of my biggest disappointments, because I dabble quite a bit in old baseball wire photos, is not coming across a picture of just the two of them together.
Hmm.
But yeah, this was, I mean, you know, the Giants were the bad guys, and you know, you mentioned how that, you know, they were hated wherever they went, and back then they would go in these carts in the early 1900s, led by horses, and they'd go from the hotel to the ballpark. And when they were visiting in other cities, you know, fans would hoot them and throw things at them, and sometimes not just tomatoes, but Donlin even would tell stories when they would throw things like bricks at
Wow.
them. And you know, the Giants drew very well wherever they went, because they were like the Yankees would become a couple decades later. They were winning pretty regularly at this time in this era.
Steve, do we know where this photo was taken?
No, I do not know, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure where that would be, if that is the Polo Grounds, with looking at some of that overhang. I'm not a ballpark expert, so I can't
Yeah.
say.
Okay. So again, that photo from the 1906 season, the Giants wore the world champions emblazoned on the front. They were the defending champions, having won it all in 1905. A few moments ago, Steve, you talked about all the seasons that he missed. He did not play at all in 1909 and 1910, and then did return in 1911. So what happened in '09 and 10? Was that an interest in acting in Hollywood, or was there something else going on?
Yeah, it started well in 1906 here. The Giants started out like gangbusters in 1906, and on May 15th, I think they were tied in first place with the Chicago Cubs. Donlin breaks his ankle. He comes back late in the season as a few pinch hitting at bats, and the Cubs catch fire. They win 116 games, and in 1907. Now Donlin is a newlywed in 1906. He misses 1907. He comes back in 1908, and we'll circle back to that. And after 1908, he joined his wife on Broadway. And Mabel was probably the most famous vaudeville actress, or one of the most famous two or three in America. And he joined her, and they traveled the country and were making a lot of money, a lot more money than he was making as a rather high paid baseball player. And those were the seasons, missing most of '06 to injury, '07, '09, and 10 with his wife.
Now in '09 and 10, what team was he under contract to?
He was still under contract with the Giants, just as he was in 1907. And you know, this complicates, I think, the relationship he had with McGraw, because McGraw understood, you know, that Donlin could make this money, and at the same time probably resented the fact that McGraw was not a member of the Giants, because McGraw needed him. It started in 1907. And while the money was a big part of it in 1910, in 1907, Donlin was not doing any acting, and he sat out the season to be with his wife in Chicago because of the love that they had for each other. It's clearly not money, because he wasn't making much money that year. So sometimes I like to focus on 7 more than 9 and 10, because it reveals something about their relationship when the money wasn't there yet.
I'm also curious about this photo. I wasn't able, when I looked on the internet and saw this photo, I wasn't able to pinpoint what date, but is this later in his career?
Yeah, I'm trying to, I think where we include the photo, we do say where it came from. It was later in his career, and I just don't have that off the top of my head right now. But yeah, here's a picture. You know, he's mellowing out a little bit, and he's even smiling a little bit. But he came back in starting in 1911, and he started bouncing around some different teams. But
Yeah.
it's
He
a
looks
great
a
photo.
lot thinner here.
Yeah, he does. He does. He certainly doesn't have the broad shoulders, and I don't remember, any reason later in his life, when we get into his Hollywood career and some of this the illnesses that he had, he became a shadow of himself. But that's a good point. Of course, with ball players in general, we look in the statistics, and we see what a ball player weighed, and what did Babe Ruth weigh, and you have one number, and it could vary during a player's 20-year career.
Right.
as the weight does vary.
Well, I did find the picture in the book. It's on page 192.
Okay.
And here's what the caption says. A month after Mike Donlin was welcomed back to the 1911 Giants with great fanfare and ceremony, he was sold to the Boston Rustlers. Despite going from a pennant contender to a tail ender, he batted .315, including .414 over the last month of the season. So it appears this is around 1911.
Yeah,
He
I think this
actually,
might be a Boston picture. And, that last statistic that you read off there is really significant because imagine you're going from a pennant contender to a team that would finish 54 games out of first place. And he had more than 100 at-bats in the month of September, and he batted more than 400. So that tells you, sometimes you wonder, did he really take the game seriously at times? Well, wow, when you're an eighth place team and you're 50 games out of first, and you're hitting over 400. And a lot of that is perhaps he wanted to show John McGraw that McGraw had made a mistake by getting rid of him. And
yeah,
and he had a great finish that year.
he actually started 1911 with the Giants. So he's making a comeback with them, but he's only with them a short time. And then he's sold to Boston of the National League, known as the Rustlers at the time. Do we know how he reacted to the deal?
Well, he was not happy that he left. I don't think we have any specific quote on it because he loved New York, and New York was the center of the universe. Although when he was in Chicago with his wife in 1907, the Cubs and the White Sox had just won the World Series, so there he was in the center of the universe. But at this point, the Rustlers were a very bad team. And Donlin wanted to come back. And I think even his wife realized that, when you're away from the game after a couple years, you're no longer the star of the game.
Yeah.
You really need to replenish that to be able to really be a big draw on Broadway. And I do want to add that when he and his wife opened on Broadway after the 1908 season, Will Rogers, decades later, said that never in his life had he heard the kinds of cheers and roar of an audience, both when
Hmm.
Donlin and Mabel opened their performance and when they did multiple encores, and it stuck with Will Rogers for 30 years, 25, 30 years, or 25 years thereafter. And Donlin, by the way, was making $6,000 or so as a Giant in 1908, one of the highest paid salaries. I think both Mathewson and Wagner were probably making about 10,000. This is mind-boggling, but when he and Mabel went on Broadway, they were pulling down the equivalent of, I think it was like $200,000 a year. It was an enormous amount of money they were making in a week, just huge dollars.
Acting still plays well, but back then baseball did not pay particularly well. 6,000 a year, even when you account for inflation and all of that. Steve,
Right.
let's talk more about his famous wife, the actress Mabel Hite. They, I guess, met while he was with the Giants. Is that correct?
They probably met beforehand. We don't know exactly when. We have 3 or 4 different accounts,
Hmm.
as you sometimes have. She was a very, very talented woman. We don't have any YouTube video of her surviving because she died very young. We can touch upon that later. But I would think that from extensive digging and reading about her, she was a little zany and kooky, and I think she was a little Carol Burnett, a little Lucille Ball, with maybe some Phyllis Diller sprinkled in there. And even though Mabel was just this kooky, and at times they even would describe some of her routines as being grotesque, she had a very sharp business mind. And when Mike was, trying to get more salary from the Giants, and sometimes he would look like he was wavering, talking to reporters because he wanted to get back to the game, she would step in and remind the reporters that until Mike gets what he's worth, he's not coming back. But she was a remarkable actress, and I think she probably knew about his drinking problem, and but she really gave him the stability that was missing in his life for so long.
they married soon after they met?
Yeah, they may have been initially a few years earlier in the, but and then they married right before the beginning of the 1906 season. And as I said, in 1907, when he recovered from his broken ankle, he could have come back, but he didn't want to be away from his wife. And basically, she was headlining in Chicago, and he stayed there, and he picked up $50 either a month or a week as the assistant manager of the theater that she was appearing in. He also played some semi-pro ball for a famous semi-pro team in Chicago. But yeah, they were really headliners on society pages across the country. They were really a power couple decades before the phrase power couple even was invented.
Yeah. Steve, was she strictly a comic actress, or did she also do dramatic roles too?
She was strictly comic.
Yeah.
She was strictly comic, and Mike learned a lot of things from Mabel, and he got his chops from really studying closely under her and with her.
Were you and Lyle able to determine if their marriage was a steady, stable relationship?
Yeah, we have no indication that while they were married that he was a womanizer. Like I said, I think she brought that stability to his life. And other than the fact in 1907, when he did have a breakdown and hit the bottle and got very drunk, and it was a very public incident that made newspaper headlines across the country. It was a very, very special relationship. And unfortunately for Mike, who experienced so much loss in his life, he was not able to grow old with this woman because she herself had a tragic ending to her life at a very young age.
Yeah, she developed intestinal cancer, and they weren't able to really help her. She died at 29.
Yeah, it's unusual to see the word cancer showing up in newspapers in 1912. She was appearing in Harlem and collapsed on stage, and we're still not really sure exactly what kind of cancer it was because back then, medicine was not where it is today, and it was obviously a great tragedy. And one wonders because this is just before silent movies really were going to take off. And if you even think about it, if she had lived a normal lifespan when talkies came about in the late 1920s, she would have been only in her 40s. So if you think Mike Donlin is a pretty obscure figure in the world of baseball, Mabel Hite is even more obscure. And she was, more of a vaudeville actress, and in vaudeville, and we get into vaudeville quite a bit in the book, what it really is, almost like a variety show. And maybe nowadays things are circling around back on television with the modern day versions of vaudeville, but there would be a number of different performers that would come on for very short periods of time, and she was very engaging.
For listeners that are not familiar with vaudeville, maybe from younger generations, I'm really not an expert on vaudeville either, but give us kind of a learning guide to what vaudeville was all about. It was on stage and it was live, but tell us a little bit more about that.
When you went to vaudeville, I mean, the theater was always there, but the theater was pretty highbrow. And for the mass of people, lower middle income, they couldn't relate to it as much. And when you went to a vaudeville show, you basically, over the course of a couple hours, might have seen 8 or 9 different performers. There may have been a guy that came out with dancing dogs. And, Mabel would have her skit actually when she and Donlin, when they opened at Hammerstein's Theater, which was the Willie Hammerstein was, I believe, the grandfather of or the father of Oscar Hammerstein, who became famous as a writing songs, Rodgers and Hammerstein. You just had this exciting variety because over the course of 2 hours, you would see 8 or 9 different shows, and Hammerstein's was famous for bringing characters out. I mean, they might have,
Hmm.
I remember reading at one time they'd have a 9-foot Russian man came out on stage. And I don't know if he was actually 9 feet tall, and he really didn't do anything. And he just stood there. And when there was a famous murder of a woman, love triangle, they would bring her out on stage. And there's one story, whether it's apocryphal or not, I'm not sure, but where somebody approached Willie Hammerstein and said, "Mr. Hammerstein, put me on stage, and for $1,000, I will commit suicide on stage." And supposedly Hammerstein paused and then said, "But what will you do for an encore?" And Willie never did. But it was just a variety of things. And when Mike and Mabel opened, it was a baseball related skit where he comes home because he's thrown out of the game by an umpire, and she asks him how many hits he got. And he was playing the Pirates, and Wagner got 4 hits, and he sheepishly tells his wife he almost got 1 hit. And so it's a little bit sort of revealing, the personal relationship. But they end making up, and they do a song and a dance, which brought the roar of the crowd.
Yeah.
But really, and vaudeville was all day long, because you would just, it was just, this is, before film, before even silent film, and they would just repeat it during the day. So a vaudeville performer, you might appear at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then again at 4 o'clock, 6 and 8 and 10.
Steve, the way you describe vaudeville, it reminds me of the time I grew up in the 1970s watching variety shows on television. Almost sounds like that.
It does, and that's why I'm saying that almost now, where you see some of these America's Got Talent and different things, whether it's come the full circle, back to that. But the thing about vaudeville is, in many ways, like baseball, I mean, you didn't have to have money to succeed. You had to have talent. And a lot of very famous actors started in vaudeville. And ultimately, the crowd was the determinant on your success.
Yeah. I'm curious, Steve, was it his marriage to Mabel Hite that led to his interest in becoming an actor, or did he have that desire before then?
I don't know if he had the desire, but as early, even early in his career, we even have a quote here from one of the sports writers saying that he could knock him dead. I mean, in terms of, his charm and his good looks, this picture is not probably quite as favorable to, that he was a pretty handsome guy.
Yeah.
And he was quite nervous initially on the stage. And we even have accounts that people like John McGraw and Ty Cobb tried doing vaudeville, and they just found they were nervous wrecks. They couldn't do it. And after Mabel died, Mike appeared in really the first feature movie. And this is a poster from that movie in 1915. And a feature film with a baseball star. And it's very interesting because it involved, even 4 years before the Black Sox scandal, gamblers that kidnapped this star player, and because they wanted to make sure his team didn't win the championship. And of course, at the end, he manages to escape and show up at the ballpark just at the end of the game to get the game-winning hit, and then capture the girl whose father said she would never let his daughter marry a baseball busher. But now that he was a hero, he wins the game, beats the gamblers, and gets the girl at the end.
That drawing on the left, do we know who that drawing is of, the actress?
Yeah, her name is at the bottom of the poster. I don't have it in front of me.
But it wasn't Mabel Hite, obviously.
No, this is 1915. This is after
Yeah.
Mike becomes a widow, and he has to pick up the pieces again. And he did remarry. He was very fortunate, as Will Rogers said. He married a lovely, a young woman who came from a famous acting family, even though she herself was not an actress. She had a bit part in this, but she was not the lead actress in this.
Now, the research that you and Lyle did shows that he starred or had small roles total in about 100 movies, even though his IMDb page only indicates about 70. So 100 films, I guess a lot of them were minor roles, but there were a few more significant parts. What kinds of films did he appear in? Was it all different kinds of genres?
Well, that's a good. It's amazing that come to think of it, that even IMDb, the International Movie Database, has him with 70, and of course, many movies never have survived. He had very, very small roles. He became a beloved guy on the back lots of Hollywood, and directors, some of them very famous directors, not some not so famous, would give him a tiny role. He's in a William Powell movie. I'm trying to remember. I think it's called One Way Voyage, that you can actually Google it and find him. And he plays a bartender mixing the perfect drink for William Powell. And he's on the screen there for about a minute, which is fairly long. He a lot of times played bad guys,
Hmm.
hold up man, or just bad guys, robbers. And he also became respected as a consultant in baseball movies, that if a director wanted to make sure that everything would be believable to the baseball fan, Donlin, if he wasn't in the movie as maybe a scout, he was behind the scenes to make sure it looked believable as a baseball film. But a lot of bad guys, a lot of bad guys.
Yeah. I get the sense he was considered a pretty good actor.
He really wasn't. He really was. And, we have an account there. He even went back on Broadway with Paul Muni in 1930. And Ed Sullivan, who became famous as a TV host, was a sort of a gossip columnist. And Sullivan just raved about Mike's role in this drama. And he was not a bad actor. I think he was not a great actor. And he became friends with two very famous actors who were his drinking buddies. And one of them was Buster Keaton.
Yep.
And Buster Keaton just loved baseball. And Donlin ended up having a small part in Keaton's movie The General, which at the time was a commercial disaster, but is now considered one of the greatest movies ever made.
Really? Wow.
And then his other drinking buddy was a famous alcoholic, which was John Barrymore, and Barrymore got Donlin apart in sort of a Moby Dick. It was the story of Moby Dick, but back then, to make it more interesting, I guess, and appealing, there was a love story involved in there. I guess Captain Ahab had his girlfriend somehow written into the movie.
Barrymore, part of one of the most famous Hollywood families. It's gone on for generations there. And he was a very colorful character in his own right.
Wow, yeah, yes. And they were very, very close, because when Mike had a very serious illness in 1927 and did not have the money to go to the Mayo Clinic, it was John Barrymore who organized in Los Angeles with a lot of movie headliners a basically a fundraiser, a benefit to be able to send Donlin for his treatment. And so they were very, very close.
We have a few minutes remaining with our guest on this edition of the virtual author series. We're talking to Steve Steinberg, who, along with Lyle Spatz, co-wrote this book, which I will show to you, Mike Donlin. It is a book that explores a rough and rowdy life from New York baseball idol to stage and screen. Very comprehensive biography, nearly 300 pages of text, full indexed as well, which I always love to see in baseball history books. When it doesn't have an index, it loses something, but having that index is just so valuable for researchers and people like myself who like to jump from one aspect of a book to another. In our remaining minutes, we'll take questions or comments in our chat room. You can just post the question or comment right there. We'll get to it between now and the end of the program. And Steve, we do have kind of a question from someone who I guess is posting under a pseudonym. It says from Mike Donlin. I tend to doubt that's his real name, but who knows? And Mike writes, I'm interested in the right off the bat movie that he and other stars were in. And this Mike Donlin asks, any copies of that movie still exist?
This movie does not exist, but a number of his movies do. I have a friend who's a real movie buff, and she'll order on Amazon a movie and tell me to go to, let's say, 17 minutes and 37 seconds, and you'll see Mike Donlin, briefly in the movie. This one does not. And so many movies back then, they were stored in the metal containers, and years later you open them and they're just like a mess of gelatinous goo. And you know, it is very sad. But in this movie, at the end, when Donlin gets the game-winning hit, the New York Giants sign him to a contract, and John McGraw appears as the Giants scout to sign him. And that was really, you know, that was really his big movie. I mean, he was the headliner of that movie. And of course, those movies, you know, they sort of cleaned them up. They didn't talk about his drinking, just like when Ronald Reagan played Grover Cleveland Alexander. I don't think alcoholism, as I recall, was even mentioned in that movie at all either.
Interesting. The movie right off the bat, is that the first baseball movie ever?
Well, you know, there were different reels and highlights. I think in terms of a feature film, and I may not be on there, you know, I may be on a little bit shaky ground here, but I have reason to believe that it might very well have been. This was 1915, and it like I said, it was a feature film, and you know, he had retired at that time. Or actually, when it was made in 1914, he was probably still playing at the end of his career. Mike did have a couple comebacks there, so.
I put up a promotional banner or poster for a film called The Primrose Path. And one of the reasons I picked that one is that Donlin's name is actually mentioned right there. So it seems like this might be more than just a small role for him.
You know, I don't know that movie, and that is I don't think it was a real big role, but again, as I said, he was with some very great actors and actresses, and as well as some not so great, and great directors and not so great. They just would try to get a part to get Mike in the film, and you know, get him a paycheck. He did move to Hollywood in the early 1920s, and was really you know, had a lot of production. The night that he died fairly young in his early 50s. He had just come from a rap party with Ed Wynn. Some of us may remember Ed Wynn, the famous comic.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they had a party when they just finished a film, and Mike went home, went to sleep, and never woke up, and apparently died of a heart attack in his sleep in the early 1930s.
Wasn't Edwin's son an actor too?
You know, I'm not sure. You may know more about that than I don't know. Ed Wynn and his bowler hat, and um, yeah, pretty charming guy.
Yeah, I'll have to check on that. I could be wrong. It's possible. It's been known to happen. Here's another question coming in from Stan Okenka. Stan writes, great subject. Are there any living descendants of Mike Donlin?
You know, there are not. Mike and Mabel did not. There's a touching story that we have that when the Titanic went down, they tried to adopt a child from the Titanic. And ironically, that would have been, I believe that was April of 1912. So that would have been right before, just a few weeks before Mabel collapsed and went into her, you know, end of life illness. And they were turned down. I don't know the details of it. Perhaps whatever committee or organization felt that, you know, baseball player and an actress would not be, you know, ideal parents to be able to have the time to attend to children. So they never, there were no descendants. And with his second wife, he had no children either.
One of our followers, Jody Regan, points out that Keenan Wynn was Ed Wynn's son. And yes, he was a famous actor. I believe he was in an episode of The Twilight Zone and prolific. He was in many TV and film roles in the 1960s and 70s. So thank you, Jody. That's who I was thinking about, Keenan
Wow.
Wynn. Well, both Hite and his wife died young. Of course, she died extremely young at 29. Donlin passed away at the age of 55. He died in his sleep. Is it true, Steve, that he had wanted to get back into baseball just before his death?
Yeah, he always stayed in touch with baseball, and he would show up at like old timers games and benefit games, and he wanted to get back with the Giants. Of course, by this time now, you know, he had lost connections. John McGraw had died shortly, you know, and was no longer managing the Giants, and he never lost his love of the game, and he never forgot that that's you know, what made him famous.
Yeah. There's the book, Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life from New York Baseball Idol to Stage and Screen. It's a terrific book. I hope that it's selling especially well for you. It's an important contribution to baseball history, baseball literature. If you and Lyle were hoping to get maybe one theme across to readers, one particular takeaway point from reading this book, what do you think that would be?
You know, that's a great question. I just think there are so many people out there that, I mean, we've written about a few of them that they're pretty much forgotten nowadays. I mean, it's almost like there's so many stars out there in the sky. They haven't disappeared, but we only have the capacity to remember and be aware of so many of them that there's stories out there that people deserve to have their stories uncovered or rediscovered and told again, because some of these stories, like with Mike Donlin and his indomitable spirit and overcoming everything. I mean, even overcoming again, the death of Mabel and how he bounced back and continued to act and made one last comeback in baseball. There are people out there, in history that are overlooked that really shouldn't be forgotten. And that's, I think, what motivates Lyle and me to write about these people. And the funny thing is, here's somebody that was unknown, but probably in 1905 or 1908, virtually every 8-year-old kid in America knew who Mike Donlin was. Yeah. Now nobody knows who he was. Hopefully, after the book being out here, a few more people will recognize him.
Steve, by the way, has a website. It is stevesteinberg.net, and Steinberg is spelled STEINBERG.net. So stevesteinberg.net. Go there to learn even more about the book. And if you'd like to purchase the book, you can go to the University of Nebraska website. They are the publisher, excellent publisher. They do a ton of baseball books. We had several of the Nebraska books for our on-site author series this past summer. You can also purchase Steve's book, Lyle's book, at Amazon.com. So those are some of the available outlets to get this excellent book about Turkey Mike Donlin. Steve, we really thank you for your time, and we wish you all the best success. Do you and Lyle have another project that you're ready to work on next?
Well, we're poking around. We're poking around and always looking. When you do baseball research, you stumble upon things that seem intriguing, and sometimes you go down that path, and it ends up being a dead end, and other times it opens up doors. So we're not quite there yet, but we write about the dead ball era. Donlin took us to an earlier part of the dead ball era, but typically we write about that time period. Up till 1920 and maybe into the early 1920s.
Well, Steve, thank you very much for the time. We really appreciate it. Enjoyed the conversation. A subject I did not know a lot before this week, but having done some research and talked to you over this last hour, really have a much more complete picture of what Mike Donlin was all about. Really a fascinating character, both on and off the field. Steve, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks for some great questions that were interesting to ponder before answering right away. Thanks so much, Bruce.
All right, Steve Steinberg has been our guest. His book, Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life from New York Baseball Idol to Stage and Screen. It's available through the University of Nebraska, and you can also purchase it at Amazon.com. We thank Steve. We thank all of our listeners and viewers for joining us over this past hour for the virtual author series. We do have one more virtual author series scheduled. We'll be talking to Terrence Moore a little bit later on in the month of October about his a book that came out last year, 2023, about the great Hank Aaron. So that's something to look forward to as well. Thanks, everybody, for joining us here at the virtual author series at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. Have a great night, everybody. Take care.